All right, I think we'll go ahead and get things started. Like Lisa said, thank you everyone for joining. I know it's a particularly busy time of year as we head into the holiday sprint, so appreciate everyone taking a few minutes out of their day to talk caregivers in the workplace. So I'm Greg Hirschberger. I'm Managing Director of Health and Benefits at Greenwald, and I'm joined by Lisa Weber-Rayleigh, our Chief Research Officer. Like I mentioned, we're going to be talking about caregivers, specifically caregivers at work. Specifically, we're going to be presenting some results from the Workplace Wellness Survey that Greenwald has conducted in partnership with EBRI, the Employee Benefits Research Institute, in some iteration or some form for the past decade plus. The current iteration of the survey has been in its current form for the past 4 years. And what we do every year is we interview 1,500 American full-time and part-time workers of core working age, so of 21 to 64, including a national sample of about 1,000 workers and an oversample. Now that oversample changes every year. This year, we're specifically focusing in on caregivers. The survey this year was conducted online over the summer from July to August, 20-minute long survey. So this one was a bear, and we appreciate our respondents for sticking with us through the survey. At the conclusion of the survey and data processing, we weighted by race, age, gender, income, and caregiver status to reflect employed Americans in that core working age. So to start, we just want to talk a little bit about what are the demographics of working caregivers? Who are they? And looking at our data, we found that they're different from non-caregivers in the workforce in a handful of ways. Looking up at the top at average age, caregivers tend to be a little bit older. They're more likely to be women, more likely to be married, and also more likely to be Hispanic.
Yeah, and this is data that's reflected in the latest national study of caregiving done by AARP and National Alliance for Caregiving that I've had the pleasure to work on. So the last iteration was published in 2020. And we know about 21% of Americans are caregivers. We expect that that percentage may change when those organizations shift to 2025 and do the next iteration. But we do see that the prevalence of caregiving is more common among women. It is more common among African American, Hispanic, and multiracial Americans. And it's also most prevalent when you're in those middle ages of what we call 45 to 64. So this data all aligns with what we see from caregiving in the US, Greg.
So when it comes to caregivers and their place in the workforce, caregivers are more likely to be part-time workers than full-time workers. Also more likely to work remotely at least some of the time, which makes sense given their other responsibilities. When it comes to education, caregivers are less likely to be a high school graduate, but more likely, you know, if you add them up, to have at least some college experience. One area where caregivers and non-caregivers have similar demographics is on income, both household income and overall financial assets. No significant differences between the two on that front.
And I think this is where this research is invaluable, because we're looking here at working caregivers. And we know that that is a proportion of the people that are caregivers in the United States. We know that caregivers that have lower education are less often working, and they have lower incomes. They've opted out of the workforce. So I think having this slice of data that looks at workers and compares workers that are caregiving and workers that are not caregiving is really critical, because it gives us a more full picture of what is happening in the workplace.
So caregivers are most often providing care for a mother, mother-in-law, son, father, father-in-law, or daughter, um, and putting in 21 hours of average time caregiving per week, with almost 10% putting in more than 40 hours. This is on top of their job, and remember that it's not like all caregivers are working part-time. Only 24% here. So this is a 76% of caregivers working full-time and also adding an additional 21 hours on top of those caregiving responsibilities.
Yeah, I mean, this is exactly in line with Caregiving US. The most common relationships are caring for a parent or a parent-in-law or a spouse. But importantly, it's not just family caregiving, it is friends and neighbors being cared for. And then the hours per week. Caregiving US in 2020 found that working caregivers were spending 20.4 hours a week providing care, so right in that same range. And I think this is important, the hours per care, to illustrate that the caregiving experience is varied. It runs the full gamut of everything, right? So it runs from the neighbor who goes next door and cuts the elderly neighbor's grass once a week, to 24/7 around the clock care for, let's say, an aging mother who has Alzheimer's or dementia. So really full gamut there. So got to keep that in mind as we interpret the results.
Mhm. So how are our caregivers giving care? Primarily, we're looking at IADLs. Those are instrumental activities of daily living. About 90% are helping with grocery shopping or other shopping, transportation, housework, a little bit less help preparing meals. And then lower on the list, but still, a significant portion of our respondents are doing ADLs, activities of daily living, like helping people get in and out of beds and chairs, get dressed, bathe or shower, and feeding folks.
Yes, and this is important because this defines caregiving. So for workplace wellness survey that we did with eBree, it defined caregiving the same way that AARP and National Alliance for Caregiving define caregiving, which is you have to identify as an unpaid caregiver for a family member or friend in the last 12 months, and that you have to be performing at least one ADL or IADL, which are shown here on this chart.
So moving on, let's take a look at the ripple effect. So what do we mean by the ripple effect? How does caregiving influence other areas of a caregiver's life, particularly when it comes to work? So we asked our respondents to rate their overall health and well-being in a number of areas, including overall health, mental health, financial well-being, workplace well-being, and social well-being. And we found that caregivers are generally less likely to rate their own health, mental health, and financial well-being as excellent compared to non-caregivers. So we are going to focus in the next handful of slides on financial well-being. And that is because, one, we only have 30 minutes to chat, and there are plenty of things to talk about. And two, because that's the area where we see the largest gap here between caregivers and non-caregivers, at 29% of caregivers rating their financial well-being as very good or excellent, compared to 40% of non-caregivers in the workforce.
Yeah, and we're going to dive into those financial and work impacts in more detail, but the caregiving researcher in me wants to caveat this by saying that while a lot of the ripple effect on caregivers is negative, there is some positive that does come out of caregiving. About half of caregivers say that they find purpose or meaning in their caregiving for their loved ones. So I want to point that out. But again, many find it stressful, emotionally stressful, and 1 in 5 say they feel alone in their role as a caregiver, and a similar percentage say they have financial strains. Those are all stats from Caregiving in the US 2020. And so But I just wanted to caveat that there. Not all bad.
So why might some of these health scores, particularly financial health scores, be lower? Well, let's look at some actions that our caregivers have taken as a result of being a caregiver. 44% have spent their own money on caregiving expenses. And I should mention, looking at this graph, the purple is not job related, the blue is job related. And I think some of these are a little bit of job related and not job related, like when it comes to contributing to a retirement savings plan, where 18% have reduced the amount that they've contributed and 9% have stopped contributing entirely. So we see that there are a handful of actions, particularly in regards to finances, like taking on debt, and changing the amount of retirement savings contributions that caregivers have had to take as a result of their responsibilities.
Yeah. And again, this echoes caregiving in the US, right? Most common impacts that caregivers mention are stopping savings, using up their savings, and increasing that debt. So all very similar results.
So given some of the actions that caregivers have been forced to take, it's not surprising that 75% of caregivers agree that it's challenging to keep a good balance between work and caregiving responsibilities. Diving in deeper into that 75% who say that it's a challenge, about 60% say that they're overwhelmed or stressed. 40% say they don't have enough time to spend with their loved ones, and a third say that they're having to take time off from work for caregiving.
And when we ask caregivers what support they need, more information, more services, the top two things are sort of personal support to manage or help their own stress levels, emotional, physical stress levels. And the second is help for their loved one in dealing with services, eligibility, paperwork, sort of the business of getting care for their loved ones. So I think that parallels these results here.
So what are the top financial priorities for caregiving workers and non-caregiving workers? Top of the list, regardless of caregiver status, is paying your monthly bills. 66% of caregivers, 62% of non-caregivers put that up as a top financial priority. Emergency savings is very important, especially for caregivers, more so than non-caregivers, with 62% selecting that option. And saving for retirement, 40% of caregivers versus 32% of caregivers list this as a financial priority. Lower down on the list, especially for caregivers, is paying and saving for their children's college tuition, less of a priority compared to non-caregivers. And though not significant, paying for childcare as well, little less important for non-caregivers. And what about financial stressors? We asked what are the top three financial stressors, and found that caregivers and non-caregivers agree that emergency savings, retirement savings, and paying bills are again at the top of the list. However, caregivers are more stressed about paying for a medical need and paying for caregiving services than non-caregivers, which makes sense. We also asked what monthly bills in particular, as we saw 46% say that monthly bills are a financial stressor. What monthly bills cause the most stress? Caregivers are more likely to say groceries, utilities, prescription drugs, and elder care. So very basic, gotta have it types of bills, groceries and utilities, whereas non-caregivers are more likely than caregivers to say childcare and pet care.
Yeah, and caregiving in the U.S. dives a lot, and I would encourage you to go look at that research, but it does dive a lot into financial impacts as a result of caregiving. And we, when we talk about the gamut of experiences that caregivers have, we do know that caregivers who have their recipient, the person that they're providing care to, living in the caregiver's home or household, they present a whole new array of challenges in that all of the financial stressors are magnified. Almost every single one is significantly higher when the recipient is living with the caregiver in their household. So I think this data really points to, sort of from an employer perspective, needing to meet your employees where they are, right, in the challenges that they're facing. And I think for caregivers, it's really that knowing that you have that emergency savings there and dealing with things like elder care and medical needs are the most pressing things for them.
Further, we asked when asked if debt is a problem, 58% of caregivers say that medical debt in particular is a major problem. And 44% of those say that the medical debt is due to chronic illness or disability, versus 29% of non-caregivers saying their medical debt is related to chronic illness or disability. Other areas where debt is a problem: credit card debt. This is for both caregivers and non-caregivers. Personal loans or lines of credit, and then student loan debt, which is more of a problem for non-caregivers and probably partially attributed to the age difference that we spoke of earlier.
Yeah, and I think the extreme end of this that we see in caregiving in the U.S. is 3% of caregivers say they've had to file bankruptcy as a result of their caregiving. So, the debt getting extreme, the income dropping, creating an absolute nightmare financial scenario for these caregivers. That's where that can head.
And lastly, we asked how prepared workers are for a handful of financial events, and found that caregivers and non-caregivers alike generally can handle an unexpected expense of $500, 72% and 69% respectively. Once you up that to an unexpected expense of $5,000, only about 38% of caregivers and 44% of non-caregivers feel like they're prepared to meet that expense. But where we really see differences between these two groups is when it comes to the ability to work and earn income. And if they're unable to work and earn income for 6 months due to illness or injury, only 36% of caregivers think they're prepared for an event like that, and 35% think they're prepared for an event where they would have to reduce work or stop working altogether to care for a loved one for 6 months. All right, and let's wrap up today by taking a look at employer efforts around workplace wellness and work-life balance. So we asked in the past year if employees feel that their employer's efforts to help them manage their overall well-being have increased, decreased, or stayed the same. And caregivers are less likely than non-caregivers to say that their employer's efforts to improve well-being have increased in the past year. So only 14% of caregivers say they've seen an increase versus 22% of non-caregivers. More specifically, again, looking at kind of the different areas of wellness: financial wellness, mental wellness, physical well-being, and workplace well-being, we're seeing the same trend whenever these are itemized. While none of these are statistically significant, directionally, we can see that caregivers are giving their employers lower scores on average when it comes to their efforts. And work-life balance, we're seeing more of the same. Only 7% of caregivers rate their work-life balance at their employer as excellent, compared to 14% of non-caregivers. So what contributes most to work-life balance? Hours worked per week, work schedule flexibility, amount of PTO. These are things that caregivers and non-caregivers generally agree on. As we go further down the list, we see that personal connections and community activities are less important for caregivers compared to things like having a supportive supervisor or remote work flexibility. And I think it makes a whole lot of sense. They're busy. They have 21 hours of the week where they aren't working in the office, and they need to help the person they're giving care to. So things like personal connections at work or going out for volunteering activities, probably less important. So what about satisfaction with employee benefits package and with leave and PTO offerings? Again, we're seeing that caregivers are a little bit less satisfied on average than non-caregivers. Only 7% extremely satisfied with their benefits package, and 12% extremely satisfied with their PTO and leave benefits. So specifically, what benefits are available? This is, again, benefits availability at their employer. This is not uptake. Health insurance, retirement savings, dental, vision, life, generally seeing the same between caregivers and non-caregivers in terms of availability. But when we get down to long-term care insurance and an emergency savings account, caregivers are less likely than non-caregivers to have these benefits available to them. Although it seems like they're likely to be pretty aware of, the aid that benefits like this could provide.
Yeah, and I think this is great data, because this is not something that we've been able to cover in caregiving in the US in great detail in terms of the employee benefit, traditional employee benefits available. We do know that when, and I know you're going to cover this on the next slide, but when things like flexible work hours, paid sick days, paid family leave exist at a workplace, that caregivers are less likely to report work impacts like leaving early, having to take time off, all the way up through opting out of the workforce entirely, right? Retiring early, or just taking a leave of absence, quitting your job. So those benefits really are beneficial, for lack of a better word, for caregivers, obviously all employees, but for caregivers especially, to reduce them opting out of the workforce and juggling those responsibilities.
And looking at leave benefits that are offered, again, caregiver satisfaction generally lower than non-caregiver satisfaction, and here we can see why. Caregivers less apt to be given or have access to paid maternity, paid paternity, paid caregiver leave, child care assistance, and elder care assistance.
Yeah, and we know that caregivers are more likely to be part-time, so that can explain some of the access to some of these benefits, Greg. But I think what's fascinating to me is this far in the middle ability to work from home. So, we fielded this study in the summer of 2023, and we're, I guess, in this, I don't want to call it post-COVID age, but like we're living with COVID. But caregiving in the US 2020, the last time we had some data, was fielded in late 2019, pre-COVID. And I think maybe one of the silver linings that I'm seeing from this data is that at that time, only 25% of working caregivers reported they had the ability to telecommute or work from home. And so now we're seeing a doubling of that. And so perhaps this is the silver lining of COVID for caregivers, is that work flexibility has become more commonplace for some workers. Obviously, there's a difference by what kind of work people do. but I think that perhaps is allowing a little bit more flexibility, and obviously I think it's brought the caregiving situation to light as well, another benefit of COVID.
Thanks, Lisa. All right, well, that wraps us up. We have a few minutes left. Any questions? Happy to chat. Thoughts?
And pop them in the chat if you want. Or I know we had a question about the slides being available for download. The recording will be made available. Don't recall if the slides themselves will be made available. No, you're welcome, Shelley. I'm glad it was useful for you. It's really, I think we had a hard time whittling it down because we could talk about this topic many different ways. So I would encourage you to keep an eye out. We have, I think, when did the press release came out recently, right, Greg, for the caregiving component for workplace wellness?
Right. Yep. That came from eBree, and an issue brief is on, I believe it's been posted on eBree's website. If it hasn't been posted yet, it should be in the next, couple weeks. But we have a more detailed issue brief on caregiving in the workforce that is available through eBree.
Hey, Greg, got a question for you from David. David asked, what was a surprising finding for you in doing this study, or was it all more confirmatory of what you might have expected?
I would say mostly confirmatory, although I didn't expect to see as big a gaps in terms of benefit accessibility between caregivers and non-caregivers. And Lisa, like you said, I think it's explainable, especially when you think about caregivers are going to be more likely to be part-time workers. But it's something that I hadn't considered before, and it's something that, maybe if these benefits were available to them, they wouldn't be part-time workers, if they had more caregiving assistance or paternity or maternity or whatever, some of those benefits were on the last couple slides.
Yeah, and Greg, though, I know we chatted about this earlier, we do a lot of work in the benefits space, and we know that a lot of workers are not totally clued in to the benefits that they are available to them at their workplace. And it is one of those things that you kind of don't know what's there until you need it. And so there is part of me that wonders if caregivers are just a little bit more cued in or clued into the benefits available at their workplace because they've needed them. And so maybe, they have a little bit better assessment of what's available to them. And, maybe some of these non-caregivers, they've never needed an EAP or needed paid family leave. So they think they have it, and they're like, yeah, I think I've got that. So it could be a little bit of that as well.
Right.
Good question, David. Yeah, I mean, I think David has got another follow-up, right? Whether or not caregiving benefits, would move the needle to reduce turnover. I think for some employees, probably yes, right? I think we see from caregiving in the US that when there are flexible work hours, when there are paid sick days, paid family leave, telecommuting, EAP benefits offered, we do see that caregivers are more likely to stay in the workforce if they're there. I do think that there's a balance that we have to consider, that not all caregivers are in workplaces that would be conducive to sort of working from home, right? Frontline workers, you can't nurse from home, although I guess with telecommuting you could, but you can't do customer service from home. You can't drive a truck from home. So there's a wide variety of worker needs there. And I do think that there in the caregiving space, there's a bit of a chicken and an egg situation where we do know that people who are not employed are more likely to be caregivers. And it's hard to tell what the directional arrow is. And I think it's probably a little bit of both. I think that if you are someone in your family and there's someone that needs care and you maybe already work part-time or already self-employed or perhaps are unemployed, you may become the caregiver of convenience. You don't have the work to get in the way, so to speak, of caregiving. But I also think there's some people who have the opposite experience of they begin caregiving, they're juggling it while working. And honestly, if you're working a 40-some hour a week, Greg, and you're adding 21 hours of caregiving, I don't know how you juggle that. And so then you have to opt out of the workforce. So we know that there's probably stories that can go both ways.
So another thing that we looked at, and this is caregiver agnostic, but with the workplace wellness survey results, is that we looked at the number of benefits that are made available to employees. This is both leave benefits and insurance type benefits. Counted up the number and found that overall benefit satisfaction increases with the number of benefits. Now, there's a point where you reach diminishing returns and the curve kind of flattens out a little bit, but generally speaking, more benefits, higher satisfaction. And with higher satisfaction comes increased retention or likelihood to stay with your employer. So I think that maybe when it comes to things that would move the needle for an employer, I think looking at stats like that, we have this benefit, or can we offer this benefit? Can we offer more benefits? The more benefits we offer, the more benefit satisfaction will increase, and therefore retention will increase. And I know it's not that simple. We can't just have a million benefit offerings. And like I said, there's a point of diminishing returns. But we did find evidence for increased retention being related to the number of benefits being offered.
And I think that goes with some of the data you presented, Greg, about needing to meet employees where they're at in that moment, right? If you are navigating caregiving and you need support for figuring out how to pay for medical bills or prescription drugs for your loved one, that might be a candidate for a medical FSA. Or you need help with elder care while you're at work, maybe that dependent care FSA and some education around the fact that you can use that for adult care would be needed. So I think that idea, right, where we know student loan programs are really hot for people who have high student loan debt or who are saving, they're in that life stage of saving for college for their child. So I think it's a situation of making sure the benefit suite meets your employees where they're at and how you can customize that. So really great.
All right.
Thank you for the good question, everyone.
Yep. And like Lisa mentioned, this will be available on YouTube. So we'll send out where to find that, and I believe it'll be on our website as well. So thanks again, everyone, for joining, and happy holidays.
Take care, everyone. Bye.